Hi, everyone. I'm Juan Vásquez. I am finishing my master's. I'm an incoming PhD student at CU Boulder as well. And I want to talk about, I want to give a general idea of how the field of NLP is doing in Latin America. And I want to draw some conclusions from it so we can maybe improve our practices as a field. So first, I want to start this talk by, of course, thanking Professor Maria Leonor Pacheco, who proposed me for this keynote, and everyone here in Queer and AI for making this possible. Their work is great, and thank you. So first, I want to talk about a few achievements of the field, right? Like, I'm not going to go very deep into this because we all know about them, but recently the field of NLP has achieved these very efficient models for various tasks, right? Like text generation, text classification, translation, summarization, etc. I quote efficient because, of course, we know that all of this is based on certain metrics that are questionable, and we can have a debate about like who are these things serving and what are they being used for. But I think it's important to mention them. So the present question at the moment, I think, is: are large language models really intelligent? That's what a lot of people are working on. A lot of research is being done in this area, which is, of course, interesting. But of course, we know that there is lack of interpretability and therefore lack of accountability, right? So we have these amazing models. We have these tools that are even becoming very popular in the zeitgeist. People are talking about them. People are using them, but um, they are just being developed with certain goals in mind, and that's what I want to question today. So in Latin America, I don't know how well you can see this. I think it's not. I think it's very small, but you can see that. You should be able to see that the number of speakers in Latin America is quite big. We have, I don't see the number, but yeah, we have Spanish is the second most spoken language in the world, and these are the Latin American countries that speak Spanish. We have first Mexico, we have Colombia, we have Venezuela. So we can see that Spanish is a very important language worldwide. Actually, in the United States, 13% of the population speaks Spanish, and it is projected that by 2015, a third of the population is going to speak English in the US. So we can see that it's not a minority language. Uh, I also have some data about Portuguese because, in Brazil, they speak Portuguese. So we have 232 million speakers of Portuguese worldwide. And we can see that the majority are in Brazil, of course, because it's a huge country. So it's also a very important language, right? I mean, important in the sense of having a lot of speakers, of it should have a lot of representation in the field of NLP, but we're going to see that that's not the case. I have these three papers here. So first, we have learning to recognize dialect features. In this paper, the authors show that when we take into account dialectical features of languages, we can improve the results of our models, right? Which I think can be expected, right? Like if we create models specifically for certain languages and having consider the linguistic particularities of such dialects, then we're going to have better performance of these models and just having like these general models. We also have this paper, Detecting Misogyny in Spanish Tweets. So in this paper, I don't know how well you can also see this. But anyway, this is the first kind of data set that I could find just focus for detecting this kind of hate speech, right? Like this is misogyny, this is not detecting homophobia or LGBT phobia in Spanish, but this is the closest I could find. And this is from the year 2021, so it's pretty recent. And we also have this paper, Theories of Gender in NLP Bias Research, which shows how the term bias is very ill-defined, usually in papers, in NLP papers, right? Like there's not a consensus. So when authors are trying to measure or talk about gender bias in NLP, they don't even have like this definition of what gender bias is, and this leads to very diverse results, like that we cannot compare very well, right? So we don't even have like a very good framework for measuring this. I have here 4 papers that are basically all I could find for Latin American models. We have Maria, which basically summarizes large language models in Spanish. We have like this GPT-2 like model. We have Beto, which is like a bird architecture trained in Spanish. We also have this the Toxis, which was a shared task that was organized in 2021, and this was aimed at detection of toxicity comments in Spanish. They created these data sets of tweets in Spanish, and as you can imagine, the goal was to find toxicity, to classify toxicity, right? We also have this model that they were assessing linguistic generalization in language models, a dataset for Brazilian Portuguese. This is a paper in which they try to measure how well these pre-trained models encode linguistic knowledge of Brazilian Portuguese, and they found that only 52%, that the average of accuracy of the best model was only 52%, when only the best candidates were considered for each sentence. So this is so the authors report in this paper that basically these language models for Brazilian are very bad at encoding the particularities of Brazilian Portuguese, which is again, going back to the beginning, quite surprising, since Brazil is a huge country. They have a lot of native speakers of Portuguese, and yet we have this very dire panorama regarding large language models in Portuguese, in Brazilian Portuguese particularly. And also we had this shared task in 2021, Exist, and this was aimed at classification of sexism, as I mentioned before. This was for Spanish and English, and these authors gathered tweets, and they were not specifically aimed at, they were aimed just at sexism, let's put it like that. So it wasn't fine-grained, and they only considered data from Twitter and Gab, social network they mentioned. And why do I think we have this very dire situation? I think it's because of lack of institutional support, and it is expensive to annotate data and train models. As we know, in order to train these models, the large language models, we need to have like these huge computing infrastructures, which we lack in Latin America. Universities don't want to invest money in creating these, in training these language models, since they don't really think it could be like useful, or yeah, there's just lack of institutional support, like funding wise. And as we know that it is labeling data, it's expensive and it's hard. And I'm gonna first, so now that I have given like a brief idea of how the state of NLP is doing in Latin America, which we can see that there are very few papers. Like I did my master's thesis on this, and so I spent a lot of months researching this. It's not that I had a lack of time or interest or anything. Like I had to ask a lot of people, and apparently there are like literally very few resources for Latin American, just specifically Latin American models, and very few efforts, right? Like the short tasks I mentioned. Um, so first, I want to talk about some of the work that we have done in my lab. Um, Actually, we have this paper as well at the ACL. We created the first data set for LGBT phobia detection on Twitter, specifically for Mexican Spanish, because I wanted to analyze this phenomena using NLP, but then when I started working on this issue, I realized that there was no data, so I had to create all this data set. For this, we gathered 120 million tweets from 2010 to 2023. We did a lot of filtering based on keywords that we basically asked like 50 members of the LGBTQ community from all the umbrella terms, so we could have like a, a good representation of all the LGBT identities. After extracting all the tweets, we proceeded to the annotation, and you can see in the first table that the annotation agreement was very low. We annotated for LGBT phobia, not LGBT phobia. And then we did a fine-grained annotation, just trying to find specific instances of lesbophobia, gayphobia, biphobia, transphobia, and others. We decided to label others because we had other kinds, such as phobia against asexual people, and other. Actually, this label was very bad because people were, when they were unsure, they would just choose others. So I suggest you don't do these kind of things. But we just realized this at the end of the experiment, and we gathered this data set, right? So what we learned through this experience, it took us basically like a year. That is very hard to train annotators for this task, right? Because first we had a proportion of LGBT annotators, and we had the same proportion of annotators uh, from the non-LGBT community, and we found that their annotations were very, very different. We also found the problem that a lot of people were confusing the task of hate speech detection with LGBT phobia detection, because there are comments that can be like I don't know, misogynistic or racist or stuff like that, and they're not necessarily LGBT phobic, right? Like, and so it's kind of hard to make people understand, and it's also kind of hard to realize that, right? Like, because humans or annotators at least were identifying hate speech, and they were just labeling as LGBT phobia, which is again maybe not the same task. So once we created this data set, we organized this shared task that we have been running this year, and we had 43 participants. And what we tried, we basically released this data set, and we wanted to have teams creating classification models to see the results and how they were doing with this data set that we created. And basically all of them used transformers or ensemble models, of course, multilingual pre-trained models, because as I mentioned in the beginning, there are not a lot of trained models for Spanish, and actually the Spanish model of BERT, Beto, was pre-trained using Spanish in general, right? So it doesn't account for individual differences of the Mexican Spanish, which is quite different to the Spanish from Spain, or just like neutral Spanish, if such thing exists, right? So since our dataset was created having into account just Mexican Spanish, because we filtered also using geolocation. So yeah, the results were pretty bad in this short task, and so we're just going to publish these results. And I also found this paper in which which is like the closest thing I could find to what we did. They created a data set for offensive language in social media for Mexican Spanish, right? So again, this task is very similar to ours, but it's not exactly the same since they are not aimed at detecting LGBT phobia, right? They only did like a non-offensive and offensive labels. Um, and so basically that's what we have in Mexico. We can see that it's very few work, and there's a lot to be done, right? So I want to talk about this group called Data Civica. This started as basically like as a bunch of friends who wanted to like uh, answer a few questions regarding violence against women in Mexico. And they realized that there is, again, not much data in this regard. Like the Mexican state doesn't really gather data again related to crimes against the LGBT population. Like that's not an official thing they have. So that Civica was created like as a group to try to fill in these gaps. And they have achieved a few things since their creation in 2015. For example, they created this registry of missing people who basically like have gone missing, and they managed to identify their names and when they were missing and why they were missing and stuff like this. They also created this chart. Um, well, I added this quote. We have a trans senator, Maria Clemente Garcia, and she said recently last year that 90% of Mexican trans population are unemployed. But of course, this claim is very, no, I'm not going to say unfounded, but like we don't have official data to back this up, right? So um, in this chart, Data Civica, again, it was created by them. They have they gathered data from Mexican trans population, and the largest bar that you can see, it's 82% people. Data Civica found that 82% of people identify as trans before the age of 7, right? Which is like a pretty good evidence for. We also have this debate of having laws that allow kids to identify with the gender that they wish to identify, but sadly we this law didn't pass, but at least we got like some information. Data Civica created this. Then we have that only 5% of trans people identified as such before the age of 12. Then we have that 20% identify as trans in between 12 and 17 years, which is the fourth one. The fifth one is that 7.7% of people in between 18 and 29 years identify as trans, and the rest was after, which is like a very small percentage, only 0.8% after the age of 30, right? So I really like this chart because, and this data that they created, because it was all like a collective effort by them. It was not by the Mexican state, and and they basically created it to pressure into Mexican lawmakers when we were having this debate about this gender identity law for kids, for trans kids. I want to talk next about Argentina and this feminist space called Data Género. Their goal is to fight for gender equality. And basically what they do is they also were just this group of basically friends, like three women who were like, okay, let's try to answer some questions about violence against women in Argentina. And again, they realized that there's no data. The Argentinian state doesn't gather this data. They also just don't recognize crimes against women as such. It's just like general crimes. So when they realized this, they decided to create this project, Data Género, which is again a feminist collective. And what they started doing is going basically just like knocking on courts' doors, legal courts, and they were asking for their data, right? Of course, this was pretty hard for them, and legal courts were not very eager to give them their data. But they finally found this court that accepted, and they gave them all their data from their cases, and they anonymized all the data in those files, and then they trained this model called iMurai, which is basically a name entity recognition model. Um, and their main goal is to create a data observatory for crimes against women and other historically marginalized minorities in America. So basically, what this tool is you can download everything. You can train it yourself. Um, the data again is anonymized, and you can then use it to find like the most common name entity recognition, the most entities in the case. So basically, you have a file, and it's like, okay, uh, certain women, certain woman reported violence against her by her husband, whatever, and then we have the explanation of the case, and then this model is going to try to identify the most relevant terms. I mean, the most relevant terms to violence against women, right? So this is like a feminist tool to try to find like patterns against in violence against women, right? And this is one of the founders, Ivana, and I spoke with her about this and just recently, and she told me this, like, having more data does not solve any problem. And I really like that quote, because she was really, she told me that that Agénero is not trying to just create data and gather data, but they're like trying to get data in a way that is going to answer questions, right? Like, they went to these courts in Buenos Aires, uh, because these courts they knew that these courts had a lot of cases of violence against women, right? So and they were in Buenos Aires because they knew that it's like the most progressive city in Argentina, and maybe they would be eager to help them. And they found these courts, right, that gave them their data. Um, so I wait. So more about this. They don't really train. They don't. I asked her about the use of large language models in their work, and she told me that they're against using them because, as we know, this can lead to giving your data to these companies, and they want to keep this data private since it's very sensitive to the victims, and they don't really want to, help train these models. So that's why they train this locally. Uh, they also are against using language models because they don't want to, because of course they are not, they're black boxes. We don't know how they work. So they also don't want to create predictions, like associations of violence against women that they cannot explain where they come from, right? That's why they use this, we could say, old model, but at least they can like explain all the outputs, and they have the certainty that these models are not being used for training other larger models, right? They also pay their annotators. Um, they recognize them, and they have been scaling their project to Ecuador, and they are also working now with Colombia. And what they are doing is basically training people who want to learn how to code, how to create these models, and to adapt them to their local realities, right? She told me that they don't want to be like this monopoly in data gathering and data processing and stuff, but they want to democratize the use of language models and these tools that could help solve questions that are very pressing in Latin America, right? Like violence against women, LGBT population. Um, they are also now in development of a project of monitoring the Argentinian elections, but it's basically they're trying to answer the question if there is gender equality in these elections. For example, they also have the question, have trans women been included in the elections? Do women in power have actual power, or are they just being used for as diversity tokens? So these kind of questions are the ones they settle from the beginning of this project, and from then they start gathering data and gathering data, but they're guided by these questions, right? They're not just gathering data as just mentioned trans people or women or stuff like that. No, they're being very like focused and mindful about these kind of data that they are gathering, because they want to answer these specific questions. So where should we go from now in Latin America? I think that given the state that we have very few large language models, we don't have a lot of funding, as I've mentioned. I think we need maybe not to emulate the current state of the art in English. Like, I don't know if it would be useful to create pre-trained models that are as big as the English ones, and because again, we don't have the computing power, we don't even have the data, right? Like we don't even have that much data in English, in Mexican Spanish, for example, to create like our own language model that's going to be as big as the English ones. Again, like if we go to smaller countries, let's say Guatemala, Honduras, they're going to have less and less data. So creating these large language models for every single dialect is going to be harder and harder and harder, and they're going to be less efficient, and their performance is not going to be very good. So I don't know if it could be like a good effort, like not good, but like a good use of our time and our energy, right? To create like a language model for every single dialect in Spanish, given that we have so many dialects in Latin America. So maybe we can create language models that, or language technologies that are engineered having these particularities in mind, right? Like maybe create models that can achieve very good performances while not needing that much data, which of course I know it's a lot to ask, given that there's also a lot of research in that. But I think it would be a very good effort to keep in mind that creating tools for low resource languages. I'm saying this like in the case of, for example, Mexican Spanish is kind of considered like a low resource language in NLP, even though, again, we have 121 million speakers of Mexican Spanish. But given the very few resources that exist for Mexican Spanish, it can be considered like a low research language. So maybe create language technologies that are good for these kind of languages, not just because we want to like I don't know, have these goals of including indigenous languages, which is of course great, and we should democratize this, but also keep in mind that these technologies could be good for these under-resourced dialects in Latin America. Also create NLP technologies having in mind the social realities of the users. By this, I mean like I think it would be a very good effort to also create language models or NLP technologies that are not only like as academics. I know we're trying to achieve better metrics and always have these state-of-the-art results, but I think that sometimes we forget that these models, or maybe not forget, but we don't have in mind that these models should be used for something, and who's going to use these models, right? Like, what are they going to be used for? Maybe, yeah, we can achieve like an amazing classification metric for a certain task, but then how is that going to be useful for any community, right? Like maybe creating a classification model that is going to be more like user-friendly, and it's maybe not going to be achieving like state-of-the-art results, but maybe it's going to be easier to to use for people, right? Like to install, to understand what's going on. And I want to just mention, like, we can do NLP research in a queer way, and by queer I mean like decenter, this kind of hegemonic model of doing things, right? Like I mean queer in this sense, like we can, I think the Latin American case can be good, like a good example. And these, all of these groups that I show you, Data Cívica, Data Género, are doing things in a queer way, in the sense that they are thinking of other realities, and they are including all of the voices in their teams, and they are really doing things in ways that are not just useful for companies or just for academia, or for, like, their goal is not to be included into this state of the art, but it's more about like helping people and answering questions, like pressing questions. And I think we can learn a lot about this, and maybe change the way a bit. We can like maybe include a bit of these practices, or at least have in mind these kind of efforts, and be a guide in our own research. Thank you. So I don't know if anyone has any questions. If not, you can answer, you can ask. I'm going to be around these days.
Yeah, any questions?
First of all, thank you for the great talk. I had a question about your HomoMex project.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned that there was a lot of disagreement between the LGBT and like cishet annotators.
Yeah.
And I was hoping you could characterize that in a bit more detail. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if there are cases that are more subtle that the cishet annotators didn't pick up on, or cases that like outgroup annotators wouldn't be able to know are non-offensive to people in the in-group.
Yeah, so we found that cishet annotators were finding, or were annotating less LGBT phobia, like way less. And then we submitted this paper last year, and one of the reviewers was like, you should not have cishet people annotating this. So we removed them from our paper, and then this time at the ACL, they were like, why don't you have cishet annotators? So now we don't really know like what's the way, or like, yeah, we even had a debate like among the authors of the paper, like, should we include them? Should we not include them? So yeah, I think that's an open question.
Any other questions? Always the last person.
Sounds like a good idea.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, like, for creating the final labels, that's where, yeah, yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, just to riff off what you were saying, I feel like that's a contribution in and of itself, right? Is making a statement about the quality of certain annotations, right? I feel like that could be a whole nother paper in and of itself. Is like, okay, can we make recommendations for the companies that are creating these large models about like, hey, maybe these are some things that you should consider when vetting your annotators, or when making decisions about who you're going to hire as an annotator in the first place, right? Yeah, so I think that's really cool. You should keep it.
Thank you. And it was also harder to find LGBTQ annotators, of course, because people don't want to, like, some people don't want to be identified as such, like, publicly. So, like, it's very hard to get annotators who are anonymous, and like, because you have to have meetings with them and stuff like that. So that was also a challenge.
Hello, my name's Rebecca, she, her pronouns. I just want to say amazing work. It's really great to hear
Yeah.
this presentation. And I know you mentioned that it took the work took about a year, right, to
Yeah.
create a data set like this, which is incredibly surprising given the fact that Spanish should not be considered low resource at all. And I know I face this problem a lot in the work that I'm doing with like Spanish and English code switching even, right? Like how that can be considered low resource just because the annotation and the data set creation itself. So I guess I'm wondering, in that process for you, who were your key collaborators? Like, who did you refer to in the creation and like finding these resources? And also, um, you kind of already mentioned this, but in an ideal scenario, right? What kind of pipeline and resources and funds would you like to see for this? Because I also agree with you that like data agency and data autonomy should be centered around the communities and not necessarily on these like SOTA models, right? So how does the work you're doing now fit into like your ideal goal of data set creation, data set agency for communities, right? And the funds and resources that go to that. I don't know, that was kind of everywhere, but
So the first one you mentioned, the collaborators. I'm not really sure what you mean by that. Like,
I ended up having to go to a linguist who had spent
oh,
like
okay.
years creating transcribed data set for that. And that's even that took like 6 to 7 months to continue doing work on that data set. So I guess I know that I think you mentioned the data set was Twitter
Yeah.
corpus, right? And so even how you reached out to the network of annotators, how you found those people, whether it was just like outreach on Twitter. I'm just curious about that process in general.
Yeah. So that was another problem because in the beginning I was just like I want to analyze basically the attitudes of people in Mexico about the LGBTQ population in a period of 10 years. But when I started working in this, of course, I realized I needed data and there was none. So first, I was looking into the dictionaries regarding LGBTQ people and stuff, and I could only find one, and that it was just released last year, like official resource by linguists and stuff, not just like a random resource. So that was the first limitation because it was a very small dictionary. It was like the first one for Mexican Spanish. I thought it was very incomplete, so that's why I just decided to ask LGBTQ people. And then again, we found the issue of finding a lot of adult content. So yeah, and then the annotators, we found them because it was basically just asking people like I know activists and stuff, and so it was just asking them like, okay, do you know anyone who wants to collaborate with this, and we need this and we provide this and stuff like this. So first of all, like defining this dictionary, we basically set on 50 terms. We were basically asking people like, okay, so you identify as a cis lesbian woman, so what do you think are the top 10 terms that you've been offended by? And so we would just ask people and then find the most common ones, and this took a while, of course, because asking like how many, like 20 people, and then finding the most common like terms to these interviews, and then yeah, like teaching everyone about like what we were looking for, and stuff like this also took us a couple months because we did a first exercise just providing them with 100 tweets, and we were like, okay, just annotate them in a binary way, like LGBT phobia and not LGBT phobia. And we found that it was not very clear for them, even though they were LGBT, again, because of this problem of hate speech, because there was racism involved and sexism. So we had to be like, okay, maybe you can find a sexist tweet, but it's not LGBT phobic, so don't label it as such. And they were arguing and stuff. So that took us also like a couple months, these rounds of like fine tuning the annotation process.
Any more questions? I didn't see any in the Zoom chat, but if anyone on Zoom has questions, feel free to chime in. All right, let's thank our speaker one more time. Thank you,
Thank
Juan.
you.
All right, I think at this time on the schedule, we should probably be sure I'm correct about this. I think we're going to break for lunch until about 2 p.m. So we will see you after that. Yes, that is correct. Thank you, everyone.